History likes to dress up emperors in marble and gold, but let me tell you a secret. Sometimes the ending isn't glory, it's humiliation. Tonight, we're stepping into the final, chaotic hours of Emperor Nero, a man who once ruled the world's greatest empire and ended up running through gardens, barefoot, begging for a hiding place. The fall of Rome's most infamous emperor wasn't just tragic, it was absurd, pathetic, and darker than any play he ever performed on stage. Why does this matter to you? Because it's a reminder that power, when built on vanity and fear, always collapses under its own weight. Nero's death wasn't the glorious farewell of a Caesar, it was the awkward stumble of a man out of excuses, abandoned by allies, mocked by history. And the story of how he fell will make you laugh, shiver, and wonder how the mighty can crumble so pitifully. So settle in, traveler. Tonight, I'll take you into Nero's last night alive, a story filled with cowardice, betrayal, and desperate whispers in the dark. It's stranger, messier, and far more embarrassing than you've ever been told. You step into Rome at dawn and feel the air go weird, like a theatre where the lead just missed his cue. Whispers ride the cobbles. The Senate's turned, the guards gone. The palace corridors sound too clean. You're with Nero on the worst day of his life. And here's the twist. His fall isn't thunder. It's a long, squeaky hinge. Power doesn't explode. It leaks. You can smell the panic, cold bronze, stale incense, and the metallic tang of a plan that's late. By mid-morning, his messages boomerang back unopened. Friends forget how doors work. Patrons suddenly develop coughs. Discreet allies become ventilation. You watch him pace, a man raised on ovations, now counting exits like bad props. This is Rome's quiet cruelty. When a crowd decides you're yesterday's news, silence does the stabbing. He asks for a horse, a guard, a map. Anything that sounds like later. Later doesn't pick up. He tries the costume drawer because of course he does. A hood, a cloak, a panic disguised as humility. You feel the flop sweat under the wool and hear the clatter of a ring he can't stop twisting. The boy who staged fountains to run with wine now begs a groom for a nobody's saddle. It's almost funny until you remember the city's ledger of burnt houses and vanished enemies. Rome has a memory like stone, slow, patient, heavy. They slip out by the back, skirting gardens that used to bow to him. Nightbirds complain. Dogs do not. The road dust tastes of ash and old festivals as the party staggers toward a suburban villa, each hoofbeat a syllable spelling finished. You're close enough to hear his breath go shallow at ordinary noises, a gate hinge, a cough in a hedge, a cart somewhere being too cheerful, the world suddenly full of percussion he can't conduct. At Phaon's place, small, useful, not designed for emperors, he asks for a shovel, not for a garden, for a grave. That's the moment it hits you. The most powerful man alive is DIYing his exit. He frets about the depth, the width, the speed, the reputation, ever the producer, even now. You feel the chill of a practical detail carrying more weight than a crown. Dirt piles like criticism. His companions, freedmen, loyal by habit and by terror, hustle for cloth, water, and a plan with fewer adjectives. A servant tears his tunic to bind a trembling arm. Another looks for a dagger and finds only bad options and worse angles. Fear smells like old smoke and vinegar. You hear someone try a joke, because that's what people do when the cliff arrives, and it dies mid-air like a cancelled festival. He drafts a tiny will with shaking hands, keepsakes to dancers, a robe to a favorite, a small mercy to the man holding the lamp. You can feel the mind that loved stagecraft trying to tidy the mess into something with rhythm. He rehearses a line, qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me. And you hear the need inside it. Let this be a story, not a slapstick. But history has timing of its own. Hoofbeats. Not cavalry for rescue, officers for inventory. A centurion's voice at the gate fits the hour like a lid. Calm, trained, done with romance. He calls out the Senate's verdict, tidy as a tax. The villa holds its breath so hard you can hear the oil in the lamp think about burning. Hiding turns to arithmetic. This many men, that many heartbeats, no good choices left. He wavers because people do. Hands won't obey, throat won't agree. The body keeps lobbying for a different ending. The dagger feels heavier than law. An aide steadying his arm isn't loyalty so much as gravity doing someone a favor. You understand the simple truth. Most last acts are clumsy. The myths are written later by men with pens, not hands that shake. When it's done, it isn't grand. It's small, necessary, unphotogenic. A blanket, a gurgle, a line remembered or misremembered, depending on who feared whom. The centurion arrives a beat too late for theatre, and exactly on time for paperwork. He presses a finger to a throat and does the Roman thing, notes the fact, restrains the mess, calls it closed. You can almost hear the city change gear. Outside, the light is wrong for triumph. Rome inhales and starts doing what it always does. Counts, writes, divides, promotes. Servants stare at floors as if guilt lived in grain. Somewhere a baker burns a batch because the news ran faster than yeast. Power abhors a vacuum only in rhetoric. In practice, it sends a clerk. The next emperor is already in someone's sentence, even if they don't know which name to use. And you, standing there with the taste of metal and dust in your mouth, catch the leitmotif you'll hear about all series long. Empires don't fall like towers, they slouch like men in borrowed cloaks. The anticlimax is the point, which opens the next door cleanly. How did Nero, the boy who wanted applause more than oxygen, back himself into a night where a shovel mattered more than a throne? And what did Rome learn, or pretend to, from the most awkward exit in imperial memory? You can't understand that shabby villa morning without rewinding to Nero's favorite room, the stage. From the moment he tasted ovations, the job description of emperor quietly shifted from commander to headliner. He loved velvet curtains, gold leaf, and the musical key in which people said, bravo. Senators prefer their rulers carved from basalt. Nero wanted to be mahogany with a spotlight. Rome, for a while, indulged him, because indulgence is cheaper than civil war, until it realized the tab included dignity, coin, and patience. Picture the early years, a teenage prince coached by philosophers in the morning and flattered by courtiers by lunch. Seneca drafts speeches that sound like moral homework. Burrus keeps the guard tidy. The boy smiles and says the lines like a choir boy who knows he's gorgeous. For a hot minute, policy behaves. Taxes breathe, provincial governors write home in complete sentences, and Rome thinks, hey, maybe we dodged a weirdo. Then the instruments warm up backstage and the script throws its pencil in the Tiber. Nero discovers performance the way a match discovers kindling. He sings, he races, he recites tragedies with the commitment of a man auditioning for his own biography. The city teaches him a dangerous lesson. Crowds will cheer anything with rhythm if the bread is fresh. Senators clap with their faces, which is to say, not at all. The street claps with its lungs. Between those two claps, a crack opens that you can steer a dynasty through, either to safety or straight into a wall. Now add architecture to the mix. After the Great Fire, whether you take the rumor of fiddles seriously or not, The city smells like wet ash and new permits. Nero's solution is the Domus Aurea, an estate with rooms that pretend they're gardens and a statue that argues with the sun. The project says, "Look what is possible," while Rome mutters, "Look what is missing." Rebuilding should have been a hymn to resilience. It became a solo about taste. That's when applause began costing Rome more than coin. His household turned into a weather vane. Freedmen who could read a room became indispensable. The old patrician names became decor you dust before parties. Loyalty flowed toward whoever set the day's tone. Musicians, architects, the man who kept the emperor in the pitch he liked to breathe. Serious men, the kind who write dull but necessary letters, felt the floor move under their sandals. The empire didn't tilt in a night. It listed over years while everyone pretended not to spill. Policy didn't vanish. It got mood swings. 1 month, tax relief and sensible audits. Next month, surprise donations to cities that hosted his triumphal tours, as if empire were a traveling show with expensive souvenirs. Provinces learned to applaud on cue. Legions learned to wait with crossed arms. Nero wasn't cruel by hobby, he was careless by art. The difference matters to victims not at all, and to history a lot. Rival centers of gravity grew like mushrooms after rain. Poppaea knew how to whisper in corridors. Tigellinus knew how to recruit men who liked the sound of boots on marble. Even the charioteers became policy adjacent because color factions, blue, green, were opinion machines with elbow room. Rome's commoners could be charmed. The elites needed reasons. Nero rarely supplied reasons. He supplied vibes. Elites push back on vibes by sharpening paperwork. Conspiracies bloom when rulers confuse applause with consent. The Pisonian plot wasn't inevitable, it was hygienic in the way a cough is. Senators who found themselves surplus to the emperor's self-esteem began to meet in rooms without frescoes. The plot failed, as many do, but purges played out like cold showers. Every execution strummed a low chord in the city's belly. If even the famous can vanish, what hope has a shopkeeper with a loud opinion? Fear tamped down noise in the short term and fermented anger for the long one. Meanwhile, the empire's external meters started flashing. In Britain, legions fought their arson and arithmetic. In Judea, the fuse trailed smoke. In Spain and Gaul, governors learned the taste of power unchaperoned. Nero could sing to a packed theatre. He could not sing over the noise of distant payrolls. When Vindex finally raised a standard in Gaul, it wasn't a solo, more like the first violin standing up because the conductor forgot the score. Galba's name, at first a rumor, became a rhythm men could march to. Money. The most unforgiving historian filed daily reports. Donatives to the guard made loyalty feel like a subscription service. Public works sprouted like promises and withered like patience. The mint clinked longer hours. The coin thinned like compliments at the end of a bad dinner. The street will forgive spectacle as long as stew arrives on time. The legions will not. When the guard noticed the math, Nero lost his drumline. By the final year, he was living inside a house of echoes. Praetorians saluted with wrists, not eyes. Petitions arrived with less ink and more nerve. The Senate practiced boldness the way children practice jumping off low walls. When the call came that the guard had been purchased by a different future, Nero did what performers do when a crowd turns. He tried a new bit. Cloak. Hood. Exit stage. Left. It worked for 2 alleys. So when you find him counting doors at dawn, don't mistake panic for surprise. The last night only looked sudden because Rome is excellent at pretending nothing is happening until everything is: the villa, the shovel, the centurion, they're punchlines to a joke written years earlier. We'll open that joke next. The guard that decided it preferred cash to chorus, the Senate that discovered its spine only after the audience left, and the governors who learned that applause in one city can turn into orders in another before noon. Start with the Praetorian camp at dawn, the kind of grey Rome uses to change its mind without witnesses. Inside the walls, loyalty isn't a hymn, it's a ledger. Men who've guarded emperors long enough to know how panic smells notice that the donatives arrive late and thin like soup on a bad week. Tigellinus plays maestro, but even a maestro needs coin to keep the beat. You can almost hear the arithmetic clank. Armor costs, families eat, and applause doesn't spend. Rome taught the guard a simple truth. Every throne is 2 payments away from a lecture. Nero had built his brand on ovations. The guard's brand was punctual cash and predictable danger. When the accounts got cute, discipline learned sarcasm. That's why Nymphidius Sabinus, slick as olive oil on marble, could take the parade ground and sell the future with a straight face. He didn't need philosophy, he needed a number higher than Nero's. News from Gaul turned a murmur into a business meeting. Vindex rebels, Galba postures, the Western payrolls wobble, and suddenly the guard realizes it's the stock everyone wants to buy. Nymphidius whispers that Galba is generous, incorruptible, and most important, somewhere else, so promises can be large for free. The camp tastes treason like new wine, heady, risky, intoxicating. Loyalty doesn't break, it arbitrages. Nero tries the old trick, throw coin at the problem until it drowns. But the treasury's lungs are shallow, and the coin looks clipped under noon light. Praetorians weigh a purse in one hand and a rumour in the other, and discover that rumours are lighter to carry. The emperor, who never learned to read a room, finds himself in a room that has learned to read him. When guards start saluting late, history has already changed tense. The Senate watches through its curtains, rehearsing bravery in conditional verbs. Once the camp turns, their courage arrives right on cue, wrapped in rhetoric and smelling of hindsight. Decrees sharpen, messengers sprint, and a city that lived for years on compromise suddenly remembers how to pronounce public good without coughing. Don't be fooled. This isn't a spine growing, it's a weather vane catching a new wind. Meanwhile in Spain, Galba refines the art of doing the least while looking like destiny. He doesn't race toward Rome, he cultivates inevitability. Proconsular gravitas is a brand, and he prints it on everyone else's decisions. Treasurers who choose new signatures, legates who choose new letters, cities that choose new statues to clean. From far away, he becomes the tidy alternative to Nero's noise. From up close, he's a safe placeholder for men who like their plans reversible. Back in the camp, the gears lock. Nymphidius promises a donative so fat it needs its own litter. He paints Galba as the kind of emperor who won't insist on being interesting. The rank and file, who have walked more miles than metaphors, decide that a boring paymaster beats a glamorous bankrupt. A century later, we'll call this cynicism. On the day, it's rent. Shields tilt toward a different future with the gentlest clatter you've ever heard. Here's the anticlimax you were waiting for. After making himself kingmaker, Nymphidius tries on king. The guard blinks, shrugs, and kills him before lunch. It's a brutal footnote with an elegant moral. If you sell loyalty as a product, don't act surprised when your customers apply the return policy. Rome doesn't love ambition, it rents it by the hour. The city absorbs the pivot like a mat absorbing a fall. Petitions change addressees, portraits leave walls overnight. The domus aurea darkens by a degree you can feel in your gums. Shopkeepers adjust their small talk. The theatre tries a new prologue. Even the astrologers switch their adjectives. Power hasn't moved buildings, it's moved receipts. That's how quiet a coup can be when everyone already knows the punchline. Nero senses the math before he admits the message. The palace corridors learn the sound of a man pacing in a circle shaped like denial. Orders go out that sound like prayers. Prayers sound like stage directions. Stage directions meet a door that won't open. When the guard says no with its boots, every other no in Rome finds its courage. The emperor's world narrows to allies who are suddenly excellent at errands. By the time the Senate declares Nero a public enemy, it's less a blow than a timestamp. The guard has already sold tomorrow, the provinces have already bought it. Rome's famous deliberation is just a seal on a package that shipped yesterday. You can almost hear the city's sigh of administrative relief. Someone else sign the hazard pay. That's the hour when Nero reaches for a cloak and the capital reaches for a broom. Remember this rhythm. You'll hear it again across the year of the 4 emperors. Soldiers decide the tempo, senators claim they wrote the melody, and the people hum whatever keeps bread on time. The guard didn't invent the market in emperors, it just posted the opening price. Next, we follow the paperwork on the road, messages, oaths, and the long, embarrassing chase that pushed Nero to that small villa, a too shallow grave, and a centurion who arrived exactly in time to be history's straight man. Start with the post system that actually worked. The imperial couriers, sweating on the Via Appia, swapping horses at mansiones where the wine tasted like bureaucracy. You can almost hear the leather creak and the wax tablets click shut as messages outrun gossip by a nose. Last night it carried theatre rumours. This morning it carries futures, oaths to Galba, inventories for the guard, and a Senate decree being sharpened like a chef's knife. You watch clerks tie ribbon through seals as if thread could leash destiny. And for a few hours it does. The Empire's information machine isn't glamorous, it's punctual. Way stations that once moved orders to legions now move reasons for legions to move. A courier with dust in his teeth rehearses the line he's about to recite to a prefect who prefers verbs to adjectives. Galba accepted. 2 words, 4 consequences. The guard stiffens, the Senate straightens, provincial governors stop pretending to be on mute, and Nero's friends decide their shoes are fascinating. Inside the palace, the same words arrive with the temperature of steel. Letters pile like unslept hours. The scribe's hands blacken with ink that won't be needed by noon. You feel the acoustics of power change, the way rooms swallow sound when people stop believing their sentences matter. Nero reaches for the only lever he truly trusts, theatre, summon, charm, improvise. But improvisation is a luxury that runs on other people's schedules. And the city has already clocked out. Oaths flip like coins in a tavern. Centurions swear to the new payroll with the weary dignity of men who've seen emperors come and go like weather. Secretaries swear to the public good, while counting how many drafts to shred. Even priests swear to whichever altar will still have candles tomorrow. The awkward part isn't the disloyalty, it's the speed. You can taste the embarrassment in the air, like smoke left over from last year's festival. Everybody knows this should be slower, and nobody wants to die to prove it. Messages don't just spread, they rebound. A freedman who's stuck with Nero out of habit discovers that habit has a shorter range than a courier on a fresh horse. He jogs between houses that once opened at the sound of his sandals and now practice new hobbies, like silence. An ally sends back the Emperor's own letter with a bland note that reads like a shrug in Latin. This is what collapse feels like up close, stationary, doing the work swords used to do. So the route to Phaon's villa begins with paper cuts. There's no grand chase through alleys. There's a series of doors that misunderstand their purpose. A coach is unavailable, a horse is missing a shoe, a captain is at prayers for the length of a lifetime. By the time a cloak and hood appear, the city has rehearsed this scene without his permission. You step into the night air and smell wet dust, lamp oil, and a reputation cooling. On the road, Rome's outskirts perform their own commentary. Garden walls keep secrets badly. Dogs announce futures in the grammar of barks. A slave carrying figs pretends not to recognize a gate he's seen on coins. The party skirts the aqueduct's shadow because nothing makes a man feel smaller than engineering that outlives him. Nero asks what time it is and gets answers that aren't really about clocks. Meanwhile, couriers continue their honest treason. One peels off toward the Praetorian camp with a receipt for a donative that will never be paid. Another rides for the Senate with a sealed script that turns history into minutes. A third heads to the guard at the city gates, where oaths are recited as briskly as bread prices. You admire, in a grim way, the machine's neutrality. It doesn't love men, it loves roots. Back at the villa gate, legality arrives with an indoor voice. A centurion reads the Senate's sentence like a town crier, timing the rain. He isn't cruel, he's comprehensive. Public enemy, strip the name from statues, confiscate the furniture that isn't bolted. You watch the freedmen blanch at the word public, because private loyalty always loses to public paperwork. Nero listens as if tone might save him and discovers that tone is a resource he finally can't spend. The villa becomes a stage without an audience. Lamps turned low, whispers that feel too loud, a shallow trench that pretends it's practical and keeps failing at the role. Nero tries to pace, but the room is the wrong size for imperial panic. He asks for a dagger, and then a friend, and then a moment, and gets a version of all three that satisfies nobody. History's great embarrassments are small rooms with poor lighting. Outside, hoofbeats sync with pulse. Not a cavalry charge, administration on horseback. The officers who enter aren't villains, they're punctuation. They don't demand a spectacle, they require an ending. The centurion's hand, when it finally lands on a shoulder, carries as much pity as protocol allows, which is not a lot. You understand in your bones why empires last. Their functionaries can be almost gentle while being absolutely final. When the line is crossed, it is crossed quickly. There's no aria, only paperwork. A glance at a throat, a nod to a clerk, a note for the record. The centurion gives the most Roman. A blanket covers a failure of timing. A seal closes a page. A door that wouldn't open earlier now closes with conviction. Power, which loves drums, ends with a stamp. By dawn, the couriers are still at it. New names on old routes, new oaths in old mouths. Portraits tilt in villas across the city. Statues audition for survival, and shopkeepers practice the word galba until it fits their tongues. You walk back toward the forum through streets that smell of wet stone and relieved ambition and feel the next beat sneaking in. 4 emperors in 1 year, soldiers voting with boots, and a capital learning that embarrassment isn't an ending, it's a preface with excellent handwriting. At first light, Rome smells like wet ash, lamp oil, and relief no one dares enjoy out loud. You walk past doorways where portraits have been tilted just enough to pretend they never hung straight. Clerks are already at it, crossing out names, drafting new titles, and practicing Galba in the declensions their mouths forgot. Nothing booms, everything shuffles. That's how regimes change on weekdays. Damnatio memoriae is not thunder, it's sandpaper. You watch workmen chisel a nose off a statue with the courtesy of men removing a stain from marble, not a face from history. Inscriptions lose letters like teeth, then develop a charming lisp. IMP becomes IMP. You get the lesson fast. Rome doesn't erase. It edits until the page looks like it always meant this. The body is a logistical problem with a halo of rumour. You hear 3 versions before breakfast: hidden, displayed, cremated, quietly, with more pity than politics allows. Whatever the truth, the city chooses the version that helps it move on, an ending tidy enough to file. You learn the Roman trick for surviving embarrassment. Make it a detail, then make it disappear. The guard recalibrates with the grace of men who know payroll math by heart. New passwords, new officers, the same boots. You catch their expressions, not jubilation, just that small loosening around the eyes that says hazard pay is back on schedule. The camp's horns sound positively on key. Money, the most consistent senator in Rome, has voted. The Senate writes bravery in the past tense. Decrees arrive with adjectives their authors couldn't find yesterday. You watch a speech praise the public good so hard you worry it will faint. Still, the pen does real work. Amnesties here, audits there, a clean-up of trials that smelled too much like vendettas. Rome is excellent at retrofitting virtue. Galba, meanwhile, advances with the velocity of a lectern. He doesn't sprint. He accumulates. Oaths meet him on the road. Statues get a head start. Provincial treasurers begin signing his name like they always meant to. You can almost hear his brand manager, sober, safe, not Nero. In a city exhausted by spectacle, boring looks like heaven with receipts. Coins start talking before their dye cools. A fresh issue praises Libertas Restituta, which is Roman for, let's call this a reset, and never speak of the awkward bits. You jingle one and feel the thinness, silver that remembers being thicker, but messaging can make alloy taste like virtue for a season. Markets believe what tills believe. On the street, ordinary life edits itself in real time. Actors test new prologues that don't get them killed. Barbers practice jokes that travel safely across courtyards. Bakers learn to shape loaves into eagles again without smirking. You catch the city's new leitmotif. We always supported stability. It's not true, but it's useful, and usefulness is the closest thing to truth most capitals can afford on Mondays. News from the provinces arrives like weather reports. Spain is calm because Galba's there. Gaul is quiet in the exhausted way. Fires are quiet after rain. The East waits, counting ships instead of adjectives. Every courier smells like saddle soap and the future. You start to understand why empires last. The road system believes in continuity even when emperors don't. Stories condense faster than dew. By mid-week, the last line is already a line. Qualis artifex pereo. You weren't there. Almost no one was. Everyone repeats it. That's how memory launders discomfort. Make the exit clever. Make the rain a lesson. Make the city the hero. You file the quote with a raised eyebrow and an admission. Good lines stick because they help people sleep. Galba's letters to the Senate arrive with a careful temperature, warm, then cool, then firm. He promises audits without revenge, parades without choruses, taxes without surprise. You read between lines and taste the year of the 4 emperors, sneaking up like weather you can smell but not schedule. Stability feels like a guest room someone forgot to confirm. The best way to read this hour is with your fingertips. Touch the fresh mortar where a name used to be, the new wax on a seal that looks relieved, the cool bronze of a statue that survived by playing coy. The city is tidying the crime scene while inviting you to a dedication ceremony. And just as you think Rome might enjoy a quiet chapter, a horse shifts its weight in Spain, a rumor clears its throat in the guard, and you feel the next turn load. Galba's entrance, his promises, his frugality, and the small, fatal habit of underpaying men who settle arguments with boots. You meet Galba on the road like you'd meet a ledger that learned to walk. He carries good Roman virtues the way a book carries a spine, stiff, necessary, not cuddly. After Nero's velvet chaos, that feels like therapy. He salutes the standards, thanks the gods, and promises to put numbers back where applause used to live. You nod along because sobriety sounds like rain after a season of smoke. Then you watch the Praetorian's eyes and remember, rain doesn't fill an empty purse. His first mistake wears sandals to work. He cancels the ludicrous donative Nymphidius promised in his name. Legally defensible, morally tidy, politically suicidal. The guard had already spent that money in their heads. Wives promised new cloaks, taverns promised new benches, gambling debts promised silence. When Galba says no with principle, the camp hears never with contempt. You can almost feel the hinge that Nero loosened start to squeal again. In the Forum, he plays the part Rome claims to want. Audits instead of arias, prosecutions that read like spreadsheets, a public face that never smirks. He parades virtue like a standard and expects the crowd to keep time. For a week, it works. Shops reopen. Speeches grow adjectives about antiqua disciplina, that antique discipline everyone praises and few enjoy. Then bills reach kitchens, and kitchens are where philosophy goes to die. He trims hard, too hard. Tax farmers who paid for their positions discover refunds are a myth. Contractors who fattened on the Domus Aurea era find lean years arriving with interest. Provincial treasurers who practiced optimism learn the proper name is embezzlement. You admire the justice like you admire a well-made lock. Then you remember locks are judged by people who own keys. The ones without keys start whispering about alternatives with smiles. Enter Otho walking like a solution wrapped in velvet. Old friend of Nero, new friend of the guard, professional reader of rooms. He flatters where Galba corrects, spends where Galba scolds, and calls the Praetorians comrades instead of line items. He isn't subtle, he's timely. The camp doesn't need a philosopher, it needs a paymaster with bedside manner. Oaths wobble in the breeze like laundry not pinned well enough. Galba makes his second big decision with the right motive and the wrong weather. Adoption. He chooses Piso, serious, stainless, promising like an empty ledger, over Otho, who expected the nod as naturally as breath. In temples, old men clap softly for prudence. In barracks, young men yawn loudly at promises that begin with after. Otho's smile doesn't crack, it sharpens. History loves triangles. Soldiers do not. Meanwhile, Germany grows its own emperor the way a forest grows a storm. Legions under Vitellius, annoyed by bare cupboards and full lectures, hoist their general on shields because shields were made for such things. Galba, who should be buying time with coin, tries to buy it with speeches and purges that feel like rearranging jars while the barn smokes. The road system hums. and every mile marker whispers the same thing. You're outnumbered by promises you didn't make but still owe. Watch the small tells. Praetorians stop snapping to attention and start remembering knees have joints. A standard dips a hair slower than dignity allows. The officer at the palace door practices neutrality with alarming skill. Galba notices he's not blind, just stubborn, and orders discipline with a tone that worked on accountants, not on men whose resumes are scars. You hear the boots vote by silence. Rome, ever the dramatist, provides omens with suspicious punctuality. A statue loses a head, a sacrifice spits soot, a rumor swears a dolphin swam backward in the Tiber because even fish hate austerity. Superstitions are just exit polls with incense. The crowd reads them and finds their own impatience in the entrails. Otho prays in public, counts in private, and schedules courage for a morning when clocks and corridors agree. The coup, when it comes, is Roman in its tidiness. Otho buys the guards' morning with coin and promises lunch. He's carried from the camp like a verdict, kissed by standards that loved Nero's rhythm and miss it. Galba, hearing the noise approach, does the virtuous thing at the wrong speed. He goes to the forum, shows the people his adoption, and asks the city to behave. The city, which prefers conclusions to lectures, doesn't. Steel does what speeches won't. Galba falls in the middle of the place that once measured law by shadow, his antiqua disciplina, bleeding into the stones that heard better plans. Piso barely has time to become an anecdote. Heads go to the rostra to audition as warnings. The crowd pretends surprise with professional skill. The Senate reopens its drawer of brave words and discovers they all fit Otho fine. Otho rides the wave like a man who's practiced in a mirror. He pays the guard, salutes the Senate, pardons strategically, and promises the provinces he's the last emperor they'll need this week. For one thin, glittering moment, Rome believes it might have found a Nero who isn't wasteful and a Galba who isn't wooden. Then the road from Germany clears its throat. Vitellius is already marching, and the year of the 4 emperors reveals its real thesis. In a market where emperors are purchased, returns are brisk and receipts are bloody. You feel the empire stretch like wet leather the moment Vitellius's name hardens into a standard. Up in Germania, legions with winter in their bones hoist him because pay is late, pride is old, and Rome feels far away and overly tidy. 2 columns move, Valens from the lower Rhine, Cassina from the upper, like jaws meant to meet somewhere north of your patience. They carry discipline that smells of camp smoke and a rumor that sounds like certainty. Italy is soft. We will teach it astride. Back in Rome, Otho acts fast because speed is the only virtue that can bluff a head start. He pays the guard, pardons with flair, and sends letters like flares to senators, to cities, to provinces that prefer a winner to a lecture. He calls up the Marines from the fleet, smart lads who can row all day but haven't met German shields up close. He has good generals, Suetonius Paulinus, Marius Celsus, and a plan that depends on time doing him favors. Time is a cat, it doesn't fetch. The road north turns every hill into a vote. Otho wants to meet Vitellius before the German columns fully braid, so he sprints toward the Po, counting bridges like blessings. Supplies lag because mules read politics better than men. Recruits blister. The Praetorians, peacocks of the city, learn that fields don't applaud. You hear the clink of new armor trying to sound like habit. The veterans on both sides can tell the difference by noon. Cassina reaches the Alps in a mood to audition as Destiny. He tries Verona's loyalty and gets hedging. He tries to rush across the Po and meets engineers who answer in ropes and timber. Valens is still days away with a column that eats miles and sausage in equal measure. German confidence, to your ear, sounds like men who think Italy is a rumor. Then they hit a town with closed gates and discover rumor has carpenters. Otho's camp at Brixellum buzzes like a hive that knows the bear is coming. He wants a knockout. His counselors want a calendar. Suetonius Paulinus argues for waiting. Let the Danubian legions arrive. Let the Germans tire. Let arithmetic do the stabbing. Otho hears him, nods, then looks at the Praetorians polishing helmets and sees a parade he can't keep stationary. When you rule by momentum, stillness feels like treason. Skirmishes pop like oil in a pan. Small bridges, smaller villages, the kind of fights that don't get statues but do decide who eats. The Marines prove brave and green. The German cohorts prove rude and organized. The Italian militia prove why militia is a word people say with sighs. Each report reads the same. We nearly had it if. Empires die one if at a time, so do campaigns. Night rumors ruin breakfast. Cassina takes a rash oath at a banquet. Valens's scouts swear Otho's lines are thin. A local ferryman swears the Po has opinions. Omens multiply because men crave certainty when maps sulk. A statue's spear falls in Cremona. A standard strap snaps in Otho's camp. A flock of birds fails to file proper flight plans. You've seen this before. Superstition is just anxiety with choreography. The morning that matters begins like many that didn't. Otho's brother Titianus ends up de facto in command. Paulinus sulks inside Prudence. The Praetorians hum as if music guarantees outcomes. Bedriacum, flat country near Cremona, offers a stage big enough for mistakes to see each other. Lines form, drums thud, and both armies pretend they rehearsed this. Fighting is noise and mud, and men discovering what they truly believe about orders. The Praetorians hold a bit longer than anyone expected. The Germans press a bit harder than anyone hoped they wouldn't. A wagon train blunders through a gap like a bad joke. A cohort takes the wrong hill with perfect courage. If you're looking for heroics, you'll find them. If you're looking for logistics, you'll find those too. The field doesn't care which you prefer. By afternoon, tilt becomes slide. Valens' column finally bites. Cassina redeems a morning's swagger with an afternoon's pressure. Otho's line bends where second-rate troops stand next to first-rate intentions. The Marines bleed like men determined to become veterans in one day. Standards drift backward the way rain moves across a courtyard. Slow, then suddenly everywhere. Back at Brixellum, Otho listens to survivors who look older by an hour and younger by a decade. The Danubian legions are coming, someone insists. We can regroup. Another pleads. Rome has survived worse. A third swears with eyes that don't. Otho, who knows crowds and tempo, hears something else, the sound of a war that will climb into the city like smoke, coil around ordinary lives, and settle there. He chooses a small end over a large ruin. The emperor who bought time spends it on grace. He writes notes that sound like apologies to history. He orders the few who die for him to live instead. He asks that his body be burned quickly because he knows what crowds can do with souvenirs. Then he does the un-Roman thing perfectly. Roman. He kills himself to save Rome the noise. When dawn touches the Po, the year of the 4 emperors has lost one and learned nothing that will stop the next two from trying the same road with different boots. You meet Vitellius on the road to Rome, and it already smells like a banquet. Standards arrive with grease stains. Couriers carry menus with their orders. Germania has sent a stomach to govern, and for a moment the city sighs with relief. No more sermons, just pay and plenty. He enters not like a savior or a scourge, but like appetite in a laurel wreath. The streets cheer because streets like certainty, even when it waddles. Vitellius pays the right people first, and the wrong people loudly. The guard gets their donative with interest, the Senate gets courtesy with crumbs, the Treasury gets a look that says, "We'll talk later." He abolishes informers, good optics, and replaces fear with indulgence, excellent optics for exactly one season. Rome, which has a sixth sense for unsustainable moods, files the gesture under "enjoy while it lasts." Across the sea lanes and caravan spines, the East watches with the patient squint of men used to long roads. In Judea, Vespasian has legions, logistics, and the bland charisma of a quartermaster who never loses lists. Alexandria, Antioch, Caesarea. These are cities that balance books for a living. They can smell when Rome stops doing math. Word moves faster through warehouses than through temples. Somewhere between invoices, a future clears its throat. Vitellius governs like a man settling into a couch that isn't his. He trims a few hated taxes, applause, then celebrates as if the budget were an olive grove. Banquets become policy, policy becomes nap. The streets love the show until the market counts the coins and discovers theatre is paying itself. Suppliers start lengthening delivery times in the way honest men lie, with sighs. Meanwhile, the Rhine legions, Valens, Caecina, cash their victory and start quarrelling with boredom. Discipline decays the way bread does, edges first, then the middle. Everyone pretends not to notice. In Italy's north, veteran camps begin to look like wedding feasts that forgot the vows. Cities near Cremona feel the tremor of soldiers who've run out of enemies and found curiosity. Vespasian doesn't announce. He accumulates. The Danubian armies, embarrassed by Otho's end and unimpressed by Vitellius's lunches, drift toward the man who makes supply lists look like art. Egypt's grain, Rome's breakfast, leans in his direction, which is a way of voting with loaves. Mucianus in Syria brings elite gossip and polished threats. Together they write a script that travels well. We can afford to win. Vitellius senses the mood too late and answers with pageantry. He renames months, polishes statues, remembers gods he hasn't rung up in years. None of it tastes like pay. When Valens is slow to come south and Caecina grows interesting friends, the emperor tries confidence at a volume that suggests rehearsal. The streets respond with that Roman sound, cheerful, distracted, transactional. Cremona becomes a second classroom with the same awful lesson. Danubian legions march under Flavian hopes. Vitellian cohorts rally under fading loyalty. The Po Valley prepares to host more history than it wants. At Bedriacum again, lines dress, drums argue, and veterans nod because they've seen this play. Night fighting, confused orders, courage and clumsiness, braided so tight even historians can't comb them clean. The tilt becomes a slide again. Caecina hesitates, defects, reconsiders, and becomes a cautionary tale at sword point. Valens is captured in a way that feels like a bureaucratic error with blood in it. Cremona burns, warehouses, workshops, lives, because armies are terrible negotiators once bridges are behind them. The smell carries to Rome faster than messengers can explain it. The city learns once more that distant defeats are local fires waiting for a wind. In Rome, Vitellius tries surrender the Roman way, late, theatrical, pleading with walls that prefer contracts. He dresses humility in purple, parades pity, and discovers pity as a currency with very small coins. The urban cohorts fold, the people pick doorways, the capital changes owners twice in a day, and once in a line of poetry you'll learn later. When Flavian forces enter, they're not gentle. Victory paid a deposit in Cremona and wants change. The end is ugly because the middle was soft. Vitellius is dragged, mocked, ended. His body touring the city he tried to lull into forgetting arithmetic. The Flavians don't arrive as saviors, they arrive as an audit. Rome, hiccuping between cheers and shivers, watches another emperor become a past participle and promises itself its learned restraint. Restraint nods, unconvinced. Vespasian's name settles over the city like a sensible roof. Bread lines shorten, work crews lengthen, the treasury discovers it can inhale again. The new regime speaks in the grammar of bricks and drains and an amphitheatre that will eventually make even cynics grin. You can feel the year of the four emperors closing its book with calloused hands. And yet, there's a last page to turn, the Flavian bargain itself, order bought with pragmatism, spectacle rebuilt as policy, and a Roman public taught to trade applause for repairs without forgetting how quickly ledgers become legends. You meet Vespasian in the bookkeeping light of early morning. No trumpets, just ledgers that finally add. He inherits a capital with singed nerves, a treasury that wheezes, and streets that have learned to cheer and starve in the same week. His genius isn't charisma, it's calibration. He tightens the tax screws where they squeak least, sells redundant honors like clutter at a yard sale, and turns spoils from Judea into scaffolds you can touch. Rome doesn't swoon, it exhales. Start with the message. We're done auditioning emperors. He promotes competence as if it were a deity, lifts equestrians into jobs once hoarded by sulky nobles, and lets provincial talent climb without pretending to be born on the Palatine. The Senate grumbles, then remembers stipends. Soldiers stop listening for the next bid and start polishing for the next inspection. Stability feels oddly modern, dull in the best possible way. Money had been drama. Vespasian makes it plumbing. He revives old taxes, invents new ones, and shrugs at outrage with the driest line in imperial history. Pecunia non olet. Money doesn't stink, even when it comes from taxing urine collectors. It's not pretty, but it's honest about priorities. Pay troops, feed Rome, fund stone. Once payroll becomes punctual again, the praetorians rediscover manners, and the legions prefer marching to muttering. Then, bricks. You can hear the city's self-respect in the creak of cranes and the thud of ashlar. Drains get scrubbed like reputations. Roads get relaid in places that had been blaming history for potholes. Most visibly, an amphitheatre rises where Nero's lake once pouted, the future Colosseum, a civic theatre that trades private decadence for public spectacle. It's propaganda with good seating and better plumbing, and the people read it fluently. The Flavian social contract is simple enough to carve in travertine. We give you order and shows, you give us quiet streets and taxes that arrive on time. To sell it, they stage games that function like policy announcements. Bread that's fresh, water that runs, beasts that roar only at appointed hours. Titus opens the amphitheatre with a generosity stunt big enough to silence cynics for a summer. Crowds love competence when it throws a party. Security goes from improvisation to routine. Frontier commanders get clear mandates and clearer audits. Supply chains grow humorless in a way quartermasters adore. Promotions smell less like flattery and more like weathered leather. In Judea, the triumph parade's certainty, Arch of Titus, etched with loot and a moral, but the garrison paperwork reads, "Hold the peace with rations, not rumors." The empire starts sounding like itself again. Culture follows coin and stone. Latin seeps deeper into Spain and Africa through law courts and pay ledgers. Municipal elites practice Roman politics with local accents and enviable efficiency. The capital discovers it can be less anxious if provinces feel more Roman. Letters move faster because roads do. Petitions sound less desperate because magistrates answer before panic gets rhythm. Administration becomes a genre. Titus, stepping in after Vespasian, keeps the tone kindness with a spine. He handles disasters, the Vesuvius eruption, a city fire, a plague year, with brisk compassion that sets a bar future rulers will trip over. He spends where it counts, appears where it matters, and refuses to look grand while doing it. Rome tastes a brief, startling flavor. Benevolence without theater. Domitian changes the seasoning. He loves order too, but his version wears a scowl and carries a ledger like a cudgel. Trials return with sharper teeth, informers find their indoor voices again, and the palace learns to whisper as if walls remembered. Yet even under the frost, the machine works. Coinage steadies, soldiers drill, borders hold. The Flavian bargain survives by habit, even when charm leaves the room. Propaganda matures from shout to mural. Coins celebrate pax, equitas, fides, peace, fairness, trust. Not as boasts, but as checklists. The Colosseum and baths speak in stone. We built, we fed, we entertained. Arches write footnotes over streets people actually use. After a year that saw 4 emperors, Rome chooses memory that looks like masonry, not memoir. What's most instructive isn't the triumphs, it's the absence of panic. Markets keep hours, courts keep calendars, games keep tempers, the guard keeps to its barracks unless paid to parade. When scandal knocks, it finds a clerk first. In a city addicted to adrenaline, the Flavians teach the luxury of boredom. That, more than any statue, is how a regime gets under the skin. And yet you can feel the next inquiry forming at the edge of this calm. How much spectacle does a stable state owe its people? When the amphitheater's roar becomes routine, and taxes bite the same places every year, what keeps loyalty warm without lighting fires? Turn your ear toward the arena floor and the palace corridor. The answer lives between bread, blood, and the quiet arithmetic of trust. You'd think after Nero's theatrical meltdown and the merry-go-round of emperors, Rome would crave peace like a man dying of thirst craves water. Enter the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian, each carrying the heavy burden of patching up a Rome torn by civil war, betrayal, and the embarrassing memory of Nero running around half-naked, begging for sympathy. But here's the twist. Their promise of stability wasn't built on philosophy or justice. It was built on bread, bricks, and blood in the arena. Imagine the scene, streets filled with chatter about grain shipments arriving safely from Egypt. Vespasian knew better than anyone that a hungry mob was a dangerous mob. So he made sure the bellies of Rome stayed full, even if it meant squeezing provinces for every last coin. Grain became more than food, it was propaganda in a sack. Citizens could forget taxes if their stomachs were quiet. And the empire, Well, it suddenly felt a little less like chaos and a little more like home again. And then there were the games. Oh, the games. Gladiators weren't just entertainment, they were political theatre, carefully choreographed to remind the people who was boss. When Vespasian began building the Colosseum, the grand Flavian amphitheatre, he wasn't just giving the people a place to cheer. He was rewriting Nero's legacy of excess by replacing his golden palace with a monument of shared spectacle. Imagine the message: Nero built for himself, Vespasian builds for you. Talk about a PR move worthy of any modern spin doctor. The Colosseum itself was a miracle of engineering, but also a grotesque mirror of Roman society. You'd walk into its marble corridors and smell sweat, roasted meats, and fear. Tens of thousands of spectators pressed together, betting on blood while munching on free bread tossed into the crowd. Lions roaring in the pits below, gladiators sharpening swords, criminals dressed in mythological costumes, ready to die for the crowd's amusement. It wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual. The empire's wounds were healing, one slaughter at a time. And make no mistake, all of it came at a price. The spoils of the Jewish war, gold stripped from Jerusalem's temple, slaves marched across continents, paid for those grand spectacles. Rome celebrated stability on the backs of the conquered, pretending it was a gift from the gods. Walk through the Arch of Titus even today, and you'll see the menorah carved in relief, a haunting reminder that Rome's bread and games weren't free. Someone always paid, and it usually wasn't the Romans watching from the marble seats. But Vespasian was clever. He taxed everything, even urine collected from public latrines, earning him the mockery of poets who laughed that Rome smelled of money. He didn't care. "Money doesn't stink," he allegedly said, and Romans repeated the line for centuries. It was dry humor turned into policy, and it stuck. You, living in Rome at the time, might have chuckled as you dropped a coin into a latrine tax jar, not realizing that coin would later fund the games you'd scream yourself hoarse watching. Titus, his son, took over, and inherited not only the empire, but also the colossal monument of spectacle. And fate handed him disasters straight out of a divine punishment catalogue: Mount Vesuvius erupting, fires scorching Rome, and plagues sweeping through the streets. Yet Titus did what Nero never could. He played the role of the benevolent emperor. He poured resources into rebuilding, compensated victims, and used the Colosseum's opening games to rally hope. Imagine watching 100 days of non-stop gladiatorial combat and wild beast hunts while your city still smelled faintly of ash and death. That was Rome's therapy session. Still, the line between generosity and control was razor thin. Those games distracted people from asking questions about taxes, wars, or succession. Every loaf of bread handed out, every spectacle staged, whispered the same message: don't worry about politics, the emperor has it covered. In a way, the Flavian promise wasn't freedom, it was sedation, and sedation, when wrapped in marble and soaked in wine, feels almost like happiness, until it doesn't. Then came Domitian, the last of the Flavians, who turned paranoia into an art form. He loved games as much as his father and brother, but his cruelty leaked through the cracks. He staged spectacles not just for joy, but to display dominance. Senators trembled at his gaze while the crowd cheered blood in the arena. For you, sitting on the wooden benches under the scorching sun, Domitian's Rome might have felt thrilling, but beneath the roar of lions and the chants of Ave Caesar, a sense of unease lingered. Something darker was brewing. If you closed your eyes during those games, the sounds alone told the story of Rome. The clash of metal, the screams of wounded men, the roar of beasts, the cheers of the mob. The smell of iron, blood drying on sand, mixed with the sweetness of wine poured from vendors' jars. Your senses were assaulted, overwhelmed, and yet lulled. You felt part of something larger, something eternal. Bread in your hand, games before your eyes, you believed Rome was unshakable. That was the trick. That was the Flavian genius. But stability is never free, and history loves irony. The very people who cheered in the Colosseum didn't see how the empire was slowly trading freedom for comfort. Taxes rose, soldiers marched endlessly across frontiers, and emperors silenced dissent with whispers and blades. The Flavian promise was seductive: eat, cheer, and forget. And for a while, it worked, until it didn't. Rome had stitched itself back together, but the seams were already fraying. And so, the empire moved forward, bloated, entertained, distracted. The Flavians left their mark in stone and sand, in arches and arenas. But the question lingered: what happens when bread runs short and games grow dull? That's where our story leads next, because Rome, like any addict, would soon need a stronger dose. And the emperors who followed were more than willing to provide it. If Rome had therapists, they would have said the empire was finally in recovery mode during the reign of the so-called 5 good emperors. After Nero's melodrama and the Flavian circus of bread and games, people craved something quieter, something sane. Enter Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. For a glorious century, Rome seemed to believe it had cracked the code: wise emperors, stable successions, and no lunatic artists burning the city while reciting poetry. It felt almost too good to be true. The magic trick was adoption. Instead of leaving the empire to biological sons who might turn out incompetent, spoiled, or worse, emperors chose worthy heirs. Nerva, frail and elderly, set the tone by adopting Trajan, a respected general beloved by soldiers. Trajan, in turn, adopted Hadrian, who later adopted Antoninus Pius, who adopted Marcus Aurelius. It was like a relay race of stability, passing the imperial torch carefully, ensuring Rome didn't trip over another Nero. Imagine how different history might look if this system had lasted. Trajan was the empire's golden boy. He marched east, expanded frontiers, and filled Rome's coffers with spoils. Under him, the empire reached its maximum territorial size, from Britain to Mesopotamia. Walk through Trajan's Forum and you'd feel the grandeur: soaring columns, libraries, basilicas. Trajan wasn't subtle. He built like a man leaving his resume carved in marble. And Rome, drunk on conquest and loot, cheered every step of the way. Victory smelled like spices from the east, and the sweat of legionaries who never came home. Hadrian, his successor, was a different flavor of emperor. Where Trajan charged forward with legions, Hadrian pulled back, consolidating. He walked Rome's borders, literally. Imagine an emperor in a cloak, mud on his boots, inspecting distant outposts. His famous wall in Britain wasn't about expansion, but about limits. This is Rome. That's not. It was a sobering admission that the empire couldn't eat the world forever. And yet, Hadrian's love of Greek culture, philosophy, and architecture softened Rome's image, giving it a patina of sophistication. But Hadrian wasn't all marble statues and philosophy. He was also a man of contradictions, stern, moody, sometimes cruel. His grief over Antinous, the young companion who drowned in the Nile, became legendary. Hadrian deified him, scattering statues across the empire. To ordinary Romans, it might have felt strange. The emperor worshipping a boy while lecturing about discipline, but in hindsight, it humanized him. For you, living then, it was a reminder that emperors bled and mourned, just like you. Rome felt oddly intimate under Hadrian's melancholy reign. Antoninus Pius, on the other hand, was Rome's don't-rock-the-boat emperor. His reign was uneventful, which, in Rome, was a blessing. He didn't expand territories or stage grand conquests. Instead, he quietly governed, kept finances in order, and preserved peace. The empire exhaled under him, lulled into thinking this calm was permanent. Imagine living in Rome then. No rumors of civil war, no catastrophic plagues, no emperors fiddling while flames rose, just steady administration, temples repaired, and laws quietly refined. For once, boredom was the point. And then came Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the man whose diary, Meditations, still circulates today in modern self-help sections. He ruled with a pen in one hand and a sword in the other, fighting endless wars on the northern frontiers while scribbling about virtue, mortality, and resilience. Picture him in a smoky tent, parchment on his lap, whispering to himself about discipline while barbarian drums echoed in the distance. Rome saw him as noble, wise, even saintly, yet, for all his wisdom, his reign also marked the beginning of the cracks. Because here's the irony. Marcus Aurelius, champion of Stoicism, broke the sacred chain of adoption. He left the throne to his biological son, Commodus. And Commodus, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly emperor material. More gladiator than statesman, more showman than philosopher. Commodus dragged Rome back toward Nero-like chaos. Imagine the disappointment. After a century of stability, the empire collapsed back into the very nightmare it thought it had cured. Rome had tasted wisdom, only to choke on vanity once again. Still, during those years of the 5 good emperors, Rome must have felt immortal. Walk through the city street. Marble glistened, aqueducts sang with flowing water, libraries brimmed with scrolls, and markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. Citizens believed the empire could outlast the stars. Soldiers marched under banners soaked in victory, and philosophers debated under colonnades about virtue and governance. It was a dream, a mirage of eternity. But dreams, as you know, always carry the risk of waking up. The sensory landscape of Rome in this era was intoxicating. The scent of incense in temples mingled with the tang of garum sauce in crowded taverns. You'd hear Latin, Greek, and a dozen dialects echoing through marble forums. Lanterns flickered on villa walls while distant amphitheaters hummed with laughter and music. It was a world both sophisticated and raw, polished by philosophers yet funded by legions' blood. And beneath the gold, faint cracks formed, whispers of plagues, restless tribes, and an emperor who couldn't stop the march of time. If you'd lived through these reigns, you might have believed Rome had found a cure for chaos. Stability through adoption, wisdom through philosophy, peace through careful governance. But history loves its cruel jokes. Rome hadn't found the cure. It had only paused the fever. The empire's heartbeat slowed, steady and calm. Yet sickness lingered in the blood. And as Marcus Aurelius sighed in his tent, pen scratching against parchment, the seeds of decline were already sprouting in the shadow of his son. And so the empire marched on, convinced it was eternal, convinced it had solved its problems once and for all. But just beyond the horizon, storms gathered. Commodus would step into the Colosseum with a wooden sword, grinning like a child, and the illusion of Rome's eternal cure would shatter. And that, my friend, is where our journey takes us next. If Marcus Aurelius embodied wisdom, his son Commodus was the cosmic punchline. Imagine inheriting the empire at 19, with the legacy of a philosopher king looming over you. Instead of stoic journals, Commodus reached for costumes. Instead of speeches on virtue, he grinned in gladiator gear. Rome had spent nearly a century convincing itself it had found the cure for imperial madness. And then, suddenly, there he was, an emperor who thought the Colosseum was his personal stage. At first, Rome wanted to believe. Maybe Commodus just had eccentric tastes, a playful streak, but those whispers grew louder when he renamed months after himself, erected statues of Hercules with his face, and insisted people hail him not as Caesar, but as a demigod. If Marcus had scribbled about mortality in a damp tent, Commodus scribbled his name across the heavens. It was vanity on steroids, and you, sitting in the bleachers, couldn't decide whether to laugh or shiver. The games became his obsession. Commodus didn't just sponsor spectacles, he starred in them. Picture the emperor stepping into the Colosseum, bronze muscles gleaming, bow in hand, aiming at terrified animals tethered to stakes. He killed lions, ostriches, even elephants, always under the watchful eye of thousands of Romans forced to cheer. The scent of sweat and blood mingled with roasted nuts sold in the stands, while Commodus paraded around, basking in applause. For him, the empire wasn't duty, it was a performance review. But there's a catch. Gladiators fought for survival. Commodus fought with stacked odds. He demanded opponents use blunted weapons or collapse theatrically at his feet. Imagine the humiliation of skilled fighters pretending to lose against a pampered emperor child. Yet the crowd had no choice but to roar approval. Bread was free, the games were endless, and dissent was dangerous. Rome had swapped the philosopher's pen for the clown prince's wooden sword, and the trade felt cheap. Commodus wasn't just eccentric, he was paranoid. He filled palaces with spies, executed senators on flimsy charges, and reshuffled Rome's elite like pieces on a board game. Whisper against him, and you might vanish. Praise him too softly, and you might vanish. Even the Praetorian Guard, those guardians of emperors, tiptoed nervously. They knew that beneath the showmanship, Commodus was volatile, unpredictable, and frighteningly cruel. For you, an ordinary Roman, every festival carried both excitement and dread. He also drained Rome's coffers. Those endless spectacles weren't cheap. Exotic beasts had to be imported from Africa and Asia, arenas renovated, gladiators trained, and slaves sacrificed. To pay for his hobbies, Commodus hiked taxes and squeezed provinces dry. Grain still arrived, but it felt heavier, coated with resentment. Rome was addicted to the games, but the supplier was bleeding it dry. It was entertainment as anesthesia, numbing citizens while the empire slowly rotted from within. And then came the renaming spree. Commodus rechristened Rome itself as Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. Streets, temples, even legions bore his name. It was as if Nero's ghost had returned wearing Hercules' lion skin. You'd walk through the forum and see inscriptions shouting Commodus, Commodus, Commodus. The city no longer belonged to Rome, it belonged to one man's ego, and you, living under his shadow, felt history's cruel irony. Marcus Aurelius's wisdom had birthed a monster. But tyranny has a way of breeding conspiracies. Senators whispered, guards muttered, and even his inner circle tired of bowing to a self-proclaimed gladiator god. The smell of rebellion was in the air, as pungent as the metallic tang of blood in the amphitheater. Commodus trusted no one, yet he performed for everyone. It was a delicate balance, like juggling daggers blindfolded, and eventually one slipped. The end came, not on the battlefield, but in his own palace. Poisoned wine, a failed attempt, then finally a wrestler's strangling hands. The emperor, who fancied himself Hercules, died not in glory, but gasping under the weight of betrayal. Imagine the silence after his last breath. A silence Rome hadn't heard in years, the quiet absence of spectacle. The wooden sword dropped, the curtain closed, and history exhaled. For Romans, Commodus's death was liberation wrapped in uncertainty. The Senate rushed to erase him, chiseling his name from inscriptions, toppling his statues. He was declared a public enemy, his reign treated as a sickness best forgotten. Yet the damage lingered, finances strained, trust shattered, the imperial dignity dragged through the sand of the Colosseum. Rome had seen emperors killed before, but never had one turned the empire itself into a circus act. If you'd been in Rome then, you'd remember Commodus not for policies or reforms, but for the smell of beasts in cages, the roar of choreographed battles, the absurdity of an emperor in gladiator sandals. You'd recall the laughter, the forced applause, the creeping fear behind it all, and you'd realize the empire had stepped off the philosopher's path and onto a stage where spectacle mattered more than survival. And so, with Commodus gone, Rome staggered forward, dizzy from its own excess. But history wasn't done playing cruel tricks. The vacuum left by a dead gladiator emperor opened the gates to a new storm, one filled with rivals, chaos, and blood. Because when madness leaves the stage, ambition rushes in to take its place. Picture this: Commodus lies dead, strangled in his bath, and Rome breathes a sigh of relief. But relief in Rome never lasted long. The Senate scrambled, the Praetorian Guard schemed, and within hours the city was a marketplace of power. What happens when an empire tired of lunacy suddenly has no leader? In theory, senators should have restored dignity. In practice, soldiers with swords decided who sat on the throne. And that, my friend, is when Rome put itself up for sale. First came Pertinax, a man chosen for his stern discipline and reputation for honesty. Sounds like a decent upgrade after Commodus, right? But here's the problem. Honesty doesn't feed Praetorian appetites. Pertinax tried to cut expenses, rein in corruption, and demand order from men who'd grown fat on bribes. It took less than 3 months for those same guards to storm the palace and butcher him like a lamb in spring. His blood stained the marble, and with it, the illusion that Rome still respected virtue. Then came the farce. With Pertinax gone, the Praetorian Guard literally auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. Imagine soldiers shouting bids in the barracks, not for cattle or land, but for the empire itself. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, offered the fattest purse, promises of gold to every guardsman. And just like that, he was proclaimed emperor. Rome had traded philosophy and valor for cold coin. The empire was reduced to a pawn shop with swords as clerks. For ordinary Romans, the spectacle was humiliating. You'd walk through the forum hearing whispers. The empire sold like a horse. Julianus paraded as emperor, but the people spat insults at him from rooftops. Bread still reached the markets, but every loaf tasted bitter, every grain seemed tainted. Even the gods must have cringed as statues of Julianus were hoisted with forced cheers. Rome wasn't led, it was bought. And worse, everyone knew more bidders lurked beyond the city walls, because out in the provinces, powerful generals smelled opportunity. Septimius Severus in Pannonia, Pescennius Niger in the east, and Clodius Albinus in Britain all rallied legions and declared themselves rightful emperors. It wasn't politics anymore, it was a race. Soldiers sharpened swords, banners flapped in the wind, and for you, living in Rome, the horizon darkened with the promise of civil war. The auction had ignited a bidding war with blood as currency. Julianus, poor fool, tried bribing the Senate, the people, even the gods. He threw coins into the crowd, staged festivals, and promised reforms. But charisma wasn't something you could buy. When Severus marched on Rome with hardened legions, Julianus panicked. He begged the Senate for loyalty, but senators smelled weakness like wolves smell blood. Abandoned by his guards, deserted by his people, Julianus was dragged from the palace and executed. The emperor bought with gold was sold out by silence. Enter Septimius Severus. A man who understood power wasn't in speeches but in steel. He marched into Rome not as a supplicant but as a conqueror, flanked by his legions. To win loyalty, he doubled soldier pay, showered them with privileges, and reminded everyone who truly held power. For you, standing in the crowd as Severus rode through the gates, the message was clear. Emperors were no longer chosen in marble halls. They were forged in camps, carried on shields, and crowned by armies. The irony was sharp. Rome, once proud of its Senate, its traditions, its republic-born dignity, had become an empire where thrones were auctioned like theatre tickets. Citizens gossiped in taverns, sipping watered wine, shaking their heads. First a philosopher, then a gladiator, now a general. What next? The laughter was bitter, the humor dry, the future uncertain. But deep down, everyone knew. The auction had changed the rules forever. The empire had officially become a soldier's game, and the sensory experience of it all, impossible to forget. The metallic ring of coins as guards counted their bribes. The shrill cries of citizens mocking Julianus in the streets. The dust rising from Severus's legions as they thundered toward the city gates. Even the smell carried meaning. Incense in the Senate hall trying to mask fear. Sweat dripping off soldiers in the forum. The faint tang of iron hinting at blood to come. Rome didn't just watch history, it breathed it, tasted it. Yet, in the twisted logic of history, the auction was both a disgrace and a revelation. It revealed the empire's true heartbeat, not marble, not senators, not philosophers, but soldiers and money. As humiliating as it was, it stripped away illusions. Rome had always been a machine fueled by conquest, and now the machine was eating itself. If emperors could be bought, then emperors could be replaced. Permanence was gone. Only power mattered. You, as an onlooker, might have felt the weight of it all. Maybe you whispered prayers in temples. Maybe you tightened your grip on your family. Maybe you laughed at the absurdity over cups of wine. But you knew one thing. Rome was spinning, wobbling like a cartwheel on uneven stones. And soon, someone would either fix the wheel, or the cart would collapse entirely. The auction was not an end, but a doorway. And behind it, chaos was waiting. And so, with Severus in power and rivals sharpening their swords, Rome marched into a new chapter. The auction had crowned one emperor, but the echoes of coins clinking in Praetorian hands lingered. Because once you sell an empire, how do you ever buy back its dignity? That's the uneasy question pulling us into the next act. When Septimius Severus marched into Rome, the message was unmistakable. Emperors were no longer born in the Forum. They were carried on the shoulders of legions. His boots clattered on the stones of the city streets, his soldiers at his back, and senators bowed lower than they ever had for Commodus. Steel had replaced debate, and Rome's marble halls had become decoration rather than power. If you had been there, you'd have felt the weight of the swords more than the words. Severus wasted no time rewarding the men who made him emperor. Soldiers received higher pay, better land, and privileges unheard of before. It was a contract written not in parchment, but in coin and loyalty. Rome's legions adored him, and for ordinary citizens, that meant stability bought at a staggering price. Taxes rose, provinces were squeezed dry, and the empire's coffers groaned. The Senate grumbled quietly, but grumbling was all it could afford. One word too loud, and Severus's steel was waiting. The Senate itself became little more than a shadow play. Senators donned their togas, gave speeches, and pretended their words mattered. But everyone knew decisions were made in camps, not curia. You might sit in the gallery of the Senate, hear the echoes of empty rhetoric, and realize you were watching theater, political cosplay. The real empire was out there, marching, drilling, conquering. Rome had become an army with a city attached. Severus proved himself ruthless in consolidating power. His rivals, Pescennius Niger in the east and Clodius Albinus in the west, were crushed mercilessly. Severus defeated Niger's legions, paraded through Asia Minor with trophies, and then turned on Albinus in Gaul, where the battlefields were soaked in blood and mud. After victory, he showed no mercy: executions, purges, confiscations. If Commodus had played emperor, Severus reminded everyone what a real one looked like. And it was terrifying. For Romans in the city, this meant a strange mix of pride and fear. On the one hand, Severus restored order. The streets were safer, grain flowed steadily, and the empire felt strong again. On the other hand, whispers of his brutality chilled the air. Stories circulated of senators executed, of rivals flayed by politics and steel alike. You'd light incense at a temple, murmuring prayers, and wonder if the gods themselves trembled under Severus's gaze. But Severus wasn't just a butcher. He was also a builder. He restored monuments, expanded cities, and most famously erected the Arch of Septimius Severus in the Forum, carved with images of his victories. Walk beneath it, and you'd see legions marching, captives in chains, cities burning. The scent of fresh-cut marble mixed with incense as priests blessed the monument. Rome celebrated its conqueror, but the reminder was clear. This empire belonged to soldiers, and soldiers alone. Severus also tightened the empire's borders with relentless campaigns. In Britain, he marched north, braving the cold, damp winds beyond Hadrian's Wall. The sound of rain on legionary armor, the cries of tribesmen in the forests, the smell of wet earth. It all became part of Severus's legacy. He died there, far from Rome's marble, surrounded not by senators, but by soldiers. His last words to his sons echoed like a curse. Enrich the soldiers and scorn all others. The empire's future had been set in stone or steel. His sons, Caracalla and Geta, inherited the empire like squabbling heirs, fighting over a banquet table. At first, they pretended to share power, two emperors ruling together, but in the corridors of palaces, suspicion reeked stronger than incense. Within a year, Gaeta was murdered, slain in his mother's arms on Caracalla's orders. Imagine the palace floors slick with blood, courtiers staring in horror, while Caracalla claimed it was for the good of Rome. Family loyalty was sacrificed at the altar of survival. Caracalla's reign doubled down on Severus's vision. Soldiers first, everyone else second. He granted Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, a move celebrated by some as inclusion, but whispered by others as a tax scheme. More citizens meant more taxpayers, and more taxpayers meant more soldiers fed. You, as a provincial, might suddenly boast the title of Roman, but deep down you knew it was your purse, not your dignity, that the emperor craved. The sensory world of this soldier's empire was harsh. The clang of blacksmiths forging weapons rang louder than poets' verses. The smell of sweat from marching legions overpowered the perfume of roses in noble gardens. Rome still glittered with marble, but beneath the shine was iron, unforgiving, cold, absolute. The empire wasn't a dream anymore, it was a barracks, and every citizen was paying the rent. And yet, for all its brutality, Severus's empire seemed unshakable. The legions were loyal, enemies were crushed, monuments gleamed, and grain still reached the city. To you walking the crowded streets, it felt like Rome had regained its footing. But like any structure built on fear and bribes, cracks were already forming. The more emperors catered to soldiers, the more the empire's foundation shifted away from the people, the Senate, and tradition. Rome was strong, yes, but strong like a clenched fist, not a beating heart. And so, as the Severan dynasty marched forward, Rome had embraced its new reality, an empire where steel outweighed marble, where emperors lived and died by the loyalty of men with swords. But what happens when even soldiers grow restless, when the hand that feeds them trembles? That, my friend, is the storm waiting just beyond the horizon. If Rome had seemed like a fortress under Septimius Severus, the century that followed turned it into a crumbling carnival. From 235 to 284 AD, historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, but for people living through it, it was less crisis and more never-ending nightmare. In just 50 years, nearly 50 emperors rose and fell. Some lasted years, others mere months. The throne was no longer a seat of power, but a revolving door, squeaking louder with every coup. It began with the murder of Emperor Severus Alexander in 235. He'd tried to negotiate with invading tribes, but soldiers wanted blood, not bargains. Frustrated, they killed him, setting the tone for decades to come. Emperors who didn't please the legions didn't last. Imagine living in Rome, hearing news of yet another emperor crowned in a distant camp, only to hear days later he'd been butchered by his own men. Leadership felt less like destiny and more like dice thrown in the dark. The empire fractured under the weight of constant wars. Barbarian tribes pressed harder against the borders, smelling Rome's weakness. Goths raided across the Danube, Persians threatened in the east, and Germanic tribes poured into Gaul. In the west, breakaway states like the Gallic Empire formed, while in the east, the Palmyrene Empire rose under the charismatic Queen Zenobia. For a while, it seemed Rome itself might dissolve into a patchwork of warring kingdoms, its unity nothing more than memory. Economically, things collapsed. Coinage was debased until silver pieces jingled like tin. Inflation soared, bread prices skyrocketed, and ordinary Romans felt the pinch. Imagine holding a coin stamped with an emperor's face, knowing he might not live to see the harvest. Markets buzzed with gossip about which ruler had just been murdered, while merchants adjusted prices daily. Stability vanished. Every purchase felt like gambling with a broken system. And then there were the plagues. Epidemics swept through towns, thinning populations already strained by war and hunger. The smell of smoke from funeral pyres became part of the urban air, mingling with incense in temples and the sour tang of spoiled grain. You might wake to the sound of carts carrying away bodies, neighbors whispering about omens. For many, it felt like the gods themselves had abandoned Rome, their statues staring silently as cities emptied. The sensory overload was constant, the clatter of armor as rival legions marched through towns, the cries of children begging for bread, the hiss of whispers in taverns about yet another usurper crowned. Rome's streets pulsed with fear, but also numbness. Citizens grew almost indifferent. What use was loyalty when emperors fell like dominoes? You'd light a lamp at night, hear rumors in the flicker of shadows, and wonder if dawn would bring a new emperor or a new invader. Still, not all was chaos. A few emperors tried to hold the center. Decius, for example, launched campaigns to restore Rome's authority, even reviving old religious sacrifices to win divine favor. He died in battle against the Goths, swallowed by mud and steel. Gallienus, another, fought valiantly but couldn't stop the empire from fracturing. Their efforts were gallant, but gallantry was no match for corruption, assassinations, and hungry legions demanding coin. Their fates were reminders. Virtue had no insurance policy in the 3rd century. And what of the Senate, reduced to a puppet show? Senators cowered, approving whatever general-turned-emperor demanded, only to rewrite history after his death. You'd see marble inscriptions hastily chiseled over, statues toppled and replaced. The city itself became a palimpsest of failed rulers, each emperor carving his name into stone only for the next to scrape it away. For citizens, it was absurd theater. Rome wasn't ruled, it was constantly rebranded. The empire's identity fractured. In Gaul, locals toasted their Gallic emperors with rough wine. In Palmyra, traders hailed Zenobia as queen, her caravans shimmering across desert sands. In Rome, people muttered prayers for stability, clinging to the memory of emperors who lasted longer than a season. The empire was one body, but its limbs twitched separately, spasming in all directions. You could almost hear the bones of the republic groaning in its grave. And yet, survival has a strange rhythm. Despite chaos, roads still carried goods, aqueducts still flowed, markets still opened. The hum of life persisted, stubborn as weeds in cracked marble. Soldiers still drilled in camps, gladiators still fought in arenas, priests still burned incense before silent gods. Life continued not because Rome was strong, but because ordinary people refused to collapse. If anything held the empire together, it was the resilience of those who had no choice. For you, living then, the lesson was clear. Emperors came and went, but Rome endured in its streets, markets, and kitchens. You might sip watered wine, grumble about taxes, and laugh at yet another proclamation nailed to a wall. Cynicism became survival. Hope was a luxury, trust a joke, and yet, deep down, you clung to the dream that one emperor, just one, might steady the wheel before the cart shattered completely. And that's the thread pulling us forward. Out of the storm of 50 emperors and endless chaos, a figure would rise who stitched the empire back together, at least for a time. Because history, cruel as it is, loves to dangle hope right when despair feels permanent. If the crisis of the 3rd century felt like Rome was bleeding out on the battlefield, Aurelian arrived like a battlefield surgeon, harsh, quick, and ruthless. Crowned emperor, in 270 he inherited a fractured empire with barbarians crossing borders, provinces declaring independence, and coffers dangerously thin. Yet within 5 years, this hardened soldier managed to achieve what seemed impossible. He stitched the empire back together, earning the title Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. Aurelian was no aristocrat, no philosopher king. He was a soldier through and through, raised in the barracks, his hands calloused from sword hilts, his instincts sharpened by campaigns. The legions respected him not because of noble blood, but because he shared their mud, their hunger, their scars. You could almost picture him around a campfire, cloak heavy with rain, eating coarse bread with his men. Rome didn't need a dreamer, it needed a fighter, and that's exactly what it got. First came the external threats. Germanic tribes surged across the Danube, threatening Italy itself. Aurelian met them head-on, his cavalry charging across muddy plains, hooves thundering like drums of war. The smell of churned earth and iron filled the air as tribes scattered under his discipline. In quick succession, he repelled Goths, Vandals, and other groups that had grown bold during Rome's weakness. Step by step, the empire's frontiers began to feel less like open wounds and more like stitched scars. But the real challenge lay in Rome's fractured heart. The Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east had broken away during the chaos, each with their own rulers, armies, and ambitions. To many citizens, it felt like Rome's unity was gone for good. Imagine hearing traders in the marketplace speak of Zenobia in Palmyra with reverence, as though she were Rome's equal or better. The empire wasn't just divided, it was doubting itself. Aurelian marched east first, where Queen Zenobia ruled Palmyra with charisma and ambition. She wasn't a pretender, she was a phenomenon, commanding armies, expanding territories, and wearing a crown with the confidence of a Caesar. Facing her wasn't just politics, it was theatre, power against power. On the battlefield, Aurelian crushed her forces, capturing Zenobia as she fled across the desert. Picture the dust swirling around her chariot as Roman cavalry closed in, her empire collapsing with each heartbeat. Rome had its east back, but at the cost of a queen's dream. Then came the west. The Gallic Empire had grown bold under its own emperors, ruling Gaul, Britain, and Spain like a separate world. Aurelian advanced with precision, defeating their legions, reabsorbing territories. The sound of Roman standards once again flapping over conquered towns echoed like a promise. The empire was won again. Citizens cheered, soldiers banged shields, priests lit incense. For the first time in decades, people whispered with cautious relief, "Rome is whole." Back in the capital, Aurelian confronted another pressing danger, Rome itself. The city, bloated and vulnerable, had been left exposed during invasions. Aurelian ordered massive defensive walls to encircle it. The Aurelian walls, stretching for 12 miles, stone and brick towering against the horizon. Imagine walking past scaffolding, hearing hammers ring against stone, smelling dust in the air as workers toiled. These walls weren't just fortifications, they were a monument to fear and to survival. Rome admitted weakness by building them, but also resilience. Aurelian also tried to glue Rome together spiritually. He elevated the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as a unifying religion, hoping to give diverse provinces a shared symbol. Temples glowed with golden light, hymns rose to the sky, and citizens were urged to see Rome not just as power, but as faith. For you, wandering through the Forum, the sight of the blazing sun disk above altars might have felt like a promise. Rome's light would not die. Yet his ruthlessness was legendary. Aurelian didn't tolerate rebellion, dissent, or corruption. Governors who betrayed him were executed. Soldiers who wavered were punished. His justice was swift and often brutal, but in a century of chaos, brutality was a kind of clarity. You may not have loved him, but you feared him. And in Rome, fear often held the empire together more tightly than affection. Still, stability carried a price. The economy remained fragile, taxes heavy, and the population weary. Bread reached the markets, but coins jingled light in the hand, their silver long since diluted. Markets buzzed with rumors. Could one man's strength outlast an empire's weakness? Rome cheered Aurelian's victories, yet in taverns and temples alike, people whispered that no glue, no matter how strong, could hold forever what was already cracked. Aurelian's reign ended not with conquest but with betrayal. His own officers, deceived by forged documents accusing him of tyranny, murdered him on campaign. The empire that he had glued together was suddenly leaderless again, the seams straining. Picture the irony, the restorer of the world cut down not by enemies, but by paranoia within his own ranks. Rome was whole, yes, but trembling, fragile, as if one gust of wind might scatter it again. And so Aurelian's legacy lingered like sunlight after sunset. He had proven that one man's will could restore what decades of chaos had shredded. But he also showed that restoration was temporary, a pause rather than a cure. The empire breathed easier under him, but the sickness still lingered. And as Rome moved forward, the question grew sharper. How many restorers would it take before restoration was no longer possible? That, my friend, is where our story leads next. By the time Diocletian rose to power in 284 AD, Rome felt like a weary giant, too bloated to lift its own weight. The empire had been stitched together and torn apart so many times that unity seemed like a bedtime story rather than reality. But Diocletian, a soldier from humble origins, saw the truth. No single man could hold it anymore. His solution wasn't glory or conquest, it was division. And in that division, he hoped, lay salvation. Instead of one emperor staggering under the burden, he created four. The Tetrarchy, as historians later called it, divided the empire into East and West, each ruled by an Augustus with a junior Caesar beneath him. It was power distributed like a chessboard, four rulers to cover borders, crises, and revolts. To ordinary citizens, it felt strange at first, no longer one emperor's face on coins, but many. But for soldiers guarding restless frontiers, it felt like finally having a general who wasn't weeks away by messenger. Diocletian himself took the east, the wealthier half of the empire, leaving the west to his colleague Maximian. Two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, supported them, destined to succeed when their seniors stepped down. On parchment, it was brilliant, a rotating system of succession, no more desperate coups, no more soldier auctions. Imagine the relief of living in a border town, knowing your emperor wasn't a distant rumour, but stationed just a province away. And Diocletian didn't stop with politics. He reformed the army, splitting legions into smaller, more mobile units. He fortified borders with new camps, roads, and watchtowers. the empire's skin grew tougher, scarred with stone walls and outposts. For you, walking along the frontier, the clang of hammers echoed as forts rose from earth, soldiers drilled in mud, and banners snapped in cold winds. Rome's heartbeat was no longer the Senate. It was the steady march of boots across endless frontiers. Economically, he tried to fix what centuries of chaos had shattered. Inflation had turned coins into tin tokens, so Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices, setting strict limits on what goods could cost. Bakers, merchants, and farmers groaned under the weight of regulation. Imagine haggling in the market, only to have an official bark the emperor's ceiling price in your ear. Some cheated, some starved, some laughed bitterly. It was a bold experiment, but economies rarely bend to imperial will. And then there was religion. Diocletian, for all his pragmatism, believed Rome's strength lay in tradition, and tradition meant the old gods. Christianity, growing steadily in secret homes and catacombs, was seen as a threat to unity. So came the Great Persecution. Churches burned, scriptures destroyed, believers hunted. In the streets, incense rose to Jupiter, while Christians whispered prayers in shadows. For you, an ordinary Roman, the smell of smoke might sting your eyes, but the real sting was fear, of neighbors spying, of gods displeased, of soldiers knocking at night. Yet Diocletian wasn't only feared, he was admired. His court dazzled with ceremony, adopting Persian-style pomp. Emperors were no longer approachable generals. They were distant, semi-divine figures, wrapped in jewels, seated on golden thrones. If you approached the palace, you bowed low, kissed purple robes, and saw a man transformed into something more than human. Rome, once proud of blunt, soldierly rulers, now cloaked its emperors in mystique. Authority was no longer just command, it was theatre. The sensory world of the Tetrarchy was both intimidating and awe-inspiring. In Nicomedia, Diocletian's chosen capital, marble gleamed under sunlight, mosaic sparkled in basilicas, and soldiers lined the streets with polished armor. You'd hear hymns to Sol Invictus, drums of marching legions, the chatter of traders haggling in dozens of tongues. The empire was vast, diverse, unwieldy, but for the first time in decades, it felt like someone had a plan. But even plans have cracks. Rivalries between the four emperors simmered beneath the surface. Ambition whispered in palaces, egos clashed in camps. The idea of peaceful succession seemed noble, but Rome's history had taught a cruel lesson. Power rarely passes without blood. And as the years rolled forward, those whispers grew louder, like storm clouds gathering over a deceptively calm horizon. In 305, Diocletian did the unthinkable. He retired. The man who had reshaped the empire stepped away, retreating to his palace in Dalmatia to grow cabbages, or so the story goes. Imagine an emperor trading purple robes for garden soil, pruning vines while the empire he stitched together simmered. It was both inspiring and absurd, like watching a gladiator lay down his sword to knit. Rome had never seen such a thing, and never would again. For ordinary Romans, Diocletian's reforms were a mixed blessing. Taxes grew heavier, discipline stricter, but borders safer. The empire's fabric held, but it was stiff, rigid, pulled taut. You might sigh at the price of bread, groan at new levies, and still feel relief that the streets were calmer than before. Rome had survived, once more, because one man had the will to reshape it and the humility to walk away. But history is never so generous. The tetrarchy, so carefully designed, began to wobble the moment its architect left. Sons, Caesars, and rivals all eyed the throne, their ambitions sharper than Diocletian's neat lines of power. And soon the question of who should rule Rome would tear the empire again, leading to the rise of a figure even greater than Diocletian, Constantine. By the early 4th century, Rome felt like a weary traveller at a crossroads. The tetrarchy had cracked under ambition. Emperors rose and fell like dice on marble floors, and armies once again decided who ruled. Out of this storm stepped Constantine, a man who would not only seize the throne, but change the very soul of the empire. For centuries, Rome had worshipped Jupiter, Mars, and a chorus of gods. Under Constantine, Rome found a new one and never looked back. His rise was born in blood and rivalry. Constantine fought through a civil war that tore the empire apart, his most famous victory carved into legend at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. The story goes that before battle, he looked to the sky and saw a vision, a cross of light with the words "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign you will conquer. Soldiers painted the symbol on their shields, marched into combat, and crushed their enemies. Whether divine miracle or clever propaganda, it sealed Constantine's destiny. In the aftermath, he legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan, co-signed with his rival Licinius. For Christians, long hunted in shadows, it was liberation. Catacombs gave way to basilicas, whispered prayers echoed openly, and incense once burned to Jupiter now rose to the god of the cross. Imagine the transformation. Streets, once lined with shrines to countless gods, now sprouted churches, their hymns echoing through the city. Rome's spiritual heart had shifted, and with it, history's course. But Constantine wasn't only a man of visions, he was also a pragmatist. He knew Rome itself, bloated and vulnerable, could no longer be the empire's center. So he founded a new capital on the Bosporus, Constantinople. Gleaming with palaces, forums, and walls, it was strategically placed between Europe and Asia, a crossroads of trade and defense. Picture walking its fresh marble streets, smelling sea salt from 2 continents, hearing markets buzz with Greek, Latin, and Persian voices. Rome had a new Rome. His reforms touched every corner of the empire. He reorganized the army, refined administration, and introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, which stabilized the economy for centuries. The solidus jingled in purses across Europe, its weight and purity trusted like no emperor's word ever was. For merchants, it meant stability. For citizens, it meant hope. In markets once plagued by inflation, transactions rang with a sound almost divine, the clink of trustworthy gold. Constantine also fused faith with power in ways Rome had never seen. He summoned bishops to the Council of Nicaea in 325, where debates over Christ's nature raged hotter than any battlefield. Out of it came creeds, unity, and a church more organized than ever before. For you, sitting in a basilica, incense curling above as priests recited hymns, it felt as though the empire itself was being baptized. Authority no longer belonged only to soldiers or senators. It now wore the robes of bishops. And yet, Constantine's embrace of Christianity was complicated. He still honored Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and coins bore pagan symbols alongside Christian ones. He was a man straddling 2 worlds, 1 foot in Rome's pagan past, the other in its Christian future. You might stand in the Forum and see temples still active, while just down the street a new church rose. The empire glowed with contradictions, and Constantine ruled them all with pragmatic grace. The sensory world under him was dazzling. In Constantinople, mosaics glittered with golden suns and Christian crosses, their colors shifting with candlelight. Markets overflowed with spices from India, furs from the north, and silks from China. Pilgrims crowded basilicas, chanting hymns that echoed against domes. The smell of incense, the clatter of coins, the shuffle of sandals across marble. The empire felt alive again, infused with a strange new confidence. Rome was reborn, not in Rome, but in spirit. Constantine also cemented dynastic rule, securing the throne for his sons. The dream of smooth succession seemed possible again. But beneath the polished marble, tensions simmered. Pagan elites grumbled, traditionalists scoffed, and rival generals still sharpened swords. You, as a citizen, might feel both awe and unease. The empire had been restored, yes, but into something new, something unfamiliar. It was still Rome, but not the Rome your grandparents knew. And Constantine himself remained a paradox. He built churches and staged lavish games in amphitheaters. He legalized Christianity but delayed baptism until his deathbed, as if hedging his bets with eternity. He was warrior and worshipper, visionary and pragmatist, tyrant and saint. For Romans, he was both the culmination of centuries and the beginning of something wholly new. His shadow stretched far beyond his lifetime, bending history like heat bending the air. When Constantine died in 337, the empire mourned and celebrated in equal measure. His body, wrapped in purple, lay in a church, surrounded not by senators, but by bishops. Rome's emperors had once claimed descent from gods. Constantine's heirs now ruled with the blessing of Christ. The transformation was complete. Marble temples crumbled, but basilicas rose. Rome had traded Jupiter's thunder for the cross, and in doing so, stepped into a new age. And so, with Constantine, our story closes on the empire at a crossroads. What began with Nero's fall and chaos after chaos ended with a new Rome, Christian, Eastern, and eternal, in ways the old republic could never have dreamed. But the question lingered in every prayer and every coin. Had Rome found salvation, or had it simply rewritten its illusions? That, dear traveler, is the mystery Constantine left behind. And so, traveler, we leave Nero behind, not as marble, not as legend, but as a man who unraveled before the world's eyes. His final hours remind us that history is rarely noble. It is often awkward, fragile, and deeply human. Rome's emperors built arches and arenas to look eternal, yet even they tripped, panicked, and begged for mercy in the shadows. What does that say about us, centuries later, when we chase power, glory, or applause? Perhaps the story of Nero is less about his empire and more about ours, the empires we build in our lives, our pride, our illusions. How easily can they crumble when fear replaces courage, when vanity silences wisdom? If Rome's mightiest man could collapse so pitifully, what lessons are we meant to carry from his downfall? So I'll leave you with this question. Do you think history repeats because humans never change, or because we refuse to listen? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how you see Nero's ending in light of our own world. If this journey moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and join me for more stories where history whispers its secrets in the quiet of night. Because the past isn't gone, it's waiting, like a voice in the dark, to remind us of who we are.